Hey folks, it's Finn. So in this week's topic, as you can see, we are talking about cis versus trans. Okay, well, not actually like that. What I actually want to talk about is something that's come up in conversation loads recently with various different trans guys I've talked to, and that is the notion of what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to become cisgendered or as close as? How do we then define, are we always transgender, or do we reach a point where we become just man? Can we ever just describe ourselves as just man without the trans identity attached onto it? And of course there's no right or wrong answer to this at all. What I'm finding really interesting is the different ways that people think about this, and actually the different ways I think about this compared to when I first came out. Now, for me, personally, I consider myself a man. I think that transition is a process you go through, gender transition, social transition, and once you are transitioned, you're just a man. There is no need for that trans identity, right? We are just men. And I do certainly see myself as just a man, regardless. But I like the trans identity bit. For me, being trans, going through the process of being transgender, identifying as transgender and going through transition, has given me a unique perspective on life. So although I do wish to get my body as close to that of a cisgendered male as possible, in the realms of current possibility, I don't ever wish to let go of my trans identity. However, I do define myself differently in terms of, I'll say, I'm a man with a trans history, because for me, saying trans man kind of conjures up images of being less than a normal man, which is not what I mean by this. I'm a man, absolutely, but the trans bit is an additional bit to me, to my uniqueness as a male, that because of the things I've gone through, I'm in a unique position, for example, to understand what it is to be objectified as a person, to be overly sexualized, to be ignored, to be marginalized, to be all of these things, because being a woman, this happens to you in life. And I've been on the receiving end of that, so I'm much more sensitive to that as a man. I think a lot of men, and I've noticed this speaking to a lot of people when they've said certain things to women, cisgendered men I'm talking about, and they say certain things to women and you go, wow, do you realise what you just said? And they just take it for granted, some things that are said. For example, I watched an argument last week when a guy said something that was incredibly patronising to a woman, and it was kind of almost brushed over. If the same conversation had happened where a man had patronised a man in that way, it would have been very, very different. But because it was a man to a woman, it was kind of like, well, that's how it is. And I think a lot of the times men don't realise that this is so ingrained in them. So for me as a trans man, a man with a trans history, a man with a history of living half his life defined as a woman, I fully understand what it is to go through this. And so I'm more sensitive to not doing these things. So I think here what we're talking about is two separate things. We're talking about physical identity and felt identity. My physical identity will always be trans male because I have parts of my body that can never be male as defined by society's terms. If you look at the dictionary definition of cisgender, it is denoting or relating to a person whose self-identity conforms to the gender that corresponds to their biological sex. And that by definition is certain chromosomes, reproductive system, etc. So by society's terms, I won't ever be cisgendered. But again, this is all based on society's construct. What we take as natural and normal, i.e. a man being born with certain chromosomes and certain genitalia, that denotes a man. Actually, we're told this very narrow story, and I can't go off on a tangent too much because this video will be so long. We're told this story about what it is to be a man, but actually there's loads of evidence to quite the contrary. You know, there are certain genetic and biological abnormalities where somebody can appear one gender and all of a sudden change into another. You know, Google it. There's all sorts of things like that. So actually, defining a man as being born with certain chromosomes and a penis is not always correct, and vice versa. And transgender, by definition, is denoting or relating to a person whose self-identity does not conform unambiguously to conventional notions of female and male gender. So these definitions are in themselves all incredibly wobbly. As I said, what we just take for granted as natural and nature is actually constructed by society. We are the scientists, not me personally, I would never opened a science book in my life, but humanity are the scientists that have decided that this equals woman, this equals man. So when it comes to identity, the only people that really ever know who we are us. People outside of us can choose all manner of ways to describe us, but we personally are the only ones that can decide which label we take on board and own for ourselves. I fully get why some trans people go through transition and then just forget the whole trans label. As far as they're concerned, transition, the trans part of their identity was their transition in order to make their body reflect their felt gender, and then they're done. Absolutely, completely agree with that. And there are some people that call themselves transgender because they see themselves as very different to conventional males for one reason or the other, and they want to completely embrace their trans identity and go forward with it. I'm kind of somewhere between these camps, whereby I really do love my trans process that I've gone through, but I don't necessarily see it as my identity itself. My identity is myself as a man, and my trans process, my trans history, is my unique personal humanness, if that makes sense. I really find all of this incredibly fascinating. I am definitely my own psychology project ongoing. I'm finding as my identity now in this kind of final part of my transition where I'm almost done, my identity is really settling, and my concept of myself and who I am is really settling, and things like this are coming up, and much deeper questions of myself are being asked, and it's actually really wonderful to meet up with other trans guys who are having these same kind of thoughts. Am I forever trans? Am I now just male? In all of these questions, you know, it's a wonderful process of getting to know yourself on such a deep level and deciding for yourself who you really are. So that's this week's random thought that I wanted to share with you. What are your thoughts on this? As you progress in your transition, where are you? What do you feel about your identity? Are you trans? Are you just a man? Are you a trans man? Are you a trans man with a trans history? Do you call it something else? I'm really interested to know, so please do drop me a comment in the section below and let me know your thoughts. So that's it for this week, folks. Next week, I'm going to do a catch-up regarding my sexuality. I did a vlog a while back about kind of being attracted to lesbians. You can find that here. And I'm going to do a little bit of a catch-up about where I am with that, because I've had a few more insights and some incoming waffle on that. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to be kept up to date with all regular updates, and do click on all the social media links below where you can find some ridiculous selfies and so forth. Have a great rest of week and a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next week.